This was a story that I witnessed with my own eyes when I was 8 years old. That summer vacation my parents were busy with business, so I went back to my hometown to live with my grandmother. Grandma had a cousin who passed away. Because they were close acquaintances, my grandmother took me to the funeral. To get to her cousin's house, we had to go by bus. Since she didn't go out of the village often, Grandma asked a person on the street where the bus stop was. Luckily, as soon as we got there, the bus had already arrived. The distance to the grandmother's cousin's house was quite long. After sitting on the bus for more than an hour, my grandmother and I finally arrived. Everyone prepared a lot of delicious food. I ate while listening to the adults talk about funerals. It seemed that Grandma's cousin passed away quite quickly. No one in the family would have expected that after just one sleep, they had to part with her. Their family had 2 older sons, so organizing the funeral was not difficult. Early the following morning, a group of people went to the cemetery to dig a grave. I was curious, so I asked my grandmother to come along. Their cemetery was on a low mountain outside the village. Each family in the countryside had its own cemetery. The deceased would be buried in the family cemetery. Entering the cemetery, the people with pickaxes and shovels began to dig. After watching for a while, I got bored, so I ran to the side to play. While I was reading the inscriptions engraved on the tombstone, suddenly I heard the murmur of people digging graves. I ran over excitedly, not knowing what happened. The grave diggers looked so worried. Everyone was bewildered when they saw the object lying at their feet. This was probably the first time they had encountered such a thing. When they dug to a depth of more than a meter, a large rock appeared on the ground and made it impossible for them to dig any further. Those grave diggers told the family that the rock underneath was too big to be dug out. The dead woman's husband heard this and frowned, but they couldn't do anything but find another location to dig a grave. However, one of the grave diggers told the family that it was bad luck to dig 2 graves. The older man was a little angry when he heard that. He angrily said that if the grave could not be dug, where would the dead be buried? The 2 people who were digging graves were a little confused but didn't know how to solve this, so they had to do as the older man said. After discussing it, the 2 of them dug another grave not far from the old one. A few days later, the funeral was conducted. Many people came to offer their condolences to their families. Everyone was sorry for the sudden passing of the older woman. After completing the rituals, the son held his mother's photo and went to the family cemetery for burial. Maybe because the family was busy, even the first grave dug did not have time to fill it up. My grandmother and I went home after her cousin's burial, but unexpectedly just 3 days later, the family continued to report the funeral. The one crying at the door was the eldest son of my grandmother's cousin. I met him a few times at the funeral a day ago. My grandma invited him to the house, poured him water, and asked him what was wrong, and I listened at the door. The eldest son of the family took a cup of water, choking on what happened after we left his house. His younger brother was Taru. Taru was a construction worker. After the funeral ended, he also rushed back to his work. That day, Taru was pushing a cement truck when the newly built wall suddenly collapsed in front of him. By the time Taru realized danger was approaching, it was already too late. The bricks were now falling towards him. The bricks then completely covered Taru's body. Many people working nearby heard the crash and rushed to run. However, when the other workers pulled Taru out of the pile of bricks, he became a pile of shredded meat. Blood splattered everywhere. According to local custom, 2 funerals could not be held consecutively within 100 days, so Taru's coffin was not brought home. The older brother had to bring Taru's coffin to his house, but before he could get through the door, his wife stopped him. The younger brother died. The mother also died. The wife's attitude was too harsh. The couple argued loudly about this. The wife firmly refused to leave Taru's coffin in the house for fear of bad luck. But the husband did not agree to leave his brother's coffin on the street. Taru's death was pitiful enough. The couple argued for a long time, and the wife finally agreed to lay Taru's coffin inside the house, but only in the backyard. The eldest brother also had no other choice and had to ask someone to push the coffin into the backyard. Taru's coffin was placed next to a large cage. The older brother was sad, but there was nothing he could do. Just like that, the coffin was placed in the backyard to wait until the day it was buried. Even there was not a simple funeral for Taru. Early the following morning, the wife went to the backyard to feed the pigs as usual, unaware that something terrible was about to happen. Before she had time to go to the backyard, she saw the pigs suddenly rushing out. Did she forget to close the barn door yesterday? The wife thought for a while and was sure that she had closed and locked the barn door carefully yesterday. How could they get out? Fortunately, the pigs did not lose any. The wife didn't think much of it and quickly brought the pigs back to the barn. However, not knowing what happened after that, the wife looked very panicked, shouted and dropped the bucket of pig bran on the ground. Her face suddenly darkened. A cold wind blew from nowhere, causing the wife to shiver involuntarily. It turned out that her pigs collided with the coffin after escaping from the barn, causing the coffin to overturn in the middle of the yard. Taru's body was now full of bite marks. The wife's screams made the husband in the house panic and run to the backyard to see his younger brother's body lying on the ground. He burst into tears and rushed forward. The husband was holding his brother's body sobbing, and his wife was looking very panicked over there. After turning over the younger brother's body, the husband asked his wife to quickly help him put the brother's body back into the coffin. However, the wife did not want to touch the corpse. The wife's attitude and the fact that she placed the coffin in the backyard made the husband extremely angry. The wife then did not even admit her fault and said extremely outrageous words that made the husband unable to control his anger. The eldest brother could not bear it anymore, turned his head and scolded his heartless wife. Then he waved his hand and slapped his wife in the face with a very painful slap. The wife was a gentle person, never touching anyone, but this time the wife was too much. The wife covered her face with her hands and said he was an abuser, but everyone knew that the husband was only driven by anger to act like that. After saying this, the wife turned away and asked for a divorce. She kept screaming to let the neighbors know that she was beaten by her husband. The wife went into the house to get dressed, went straight to the door without saying a word. It seemed that she was thinking about going back to her mother's house. While walking to the railway section, she ran into a neighbor. Seeing that her face was swollen from the slap, the neighbor asked her about it. The wife was angry and ignored the kind neighbor. The wife even cursed under her breath, saying that he was a talkative bastard. However, just when the wife was about to cross the track, the neighbor's face immediately panicked. He shouted and stretched his hand forward to prevent the other wife from crossing the railway tracks. It turned out that there was a train ahead. The train whistle was howling, but somehow the wife still didn't hear anything and walked across the tracks. And whatever comes would come. The wife was tragically killed by a passing train. In just a few short days, their family had to receive 3 tragic deaths in a row. It was really a rare thing. The eldest son choked up and told his grandmother about the successive calamities that occurred at home and asked for my grandmother's help with the funeral. Because the relationship between the two families was good, my grandmother promised him that she would arrange the family and help them take care of the funeral. Taru was buried in a pre-dockside grave. As for the daughter-in-law, I thought it was the revenge of the younger brother. I am an introvert and full of curiosity. I thought that my personality would have no impact until one day it brought me to a strange and terrifying event. I usually observed the surrounding street from the apartment's window through the binoculars. Over time, I enjoyed looking at the view of the warehouse below, across from my apartment, and watching the scene of daily life here. I could secretly see a lot of people, from the workers working in the warehouse to the women busy shopping across the block. Until the scene of children playing on the roadside, all in my eyes was a beautiful scene that I didn't want to forget. Seeing the world around me through the small binocular was a happy thing for an introvert and shy person like me. I could freely explore the interesting life out there through the binoculars. But this thing did not mean that my relationship with those around me would be affected. I was still popular with the neighbors who lived on the same block, and every day I met them, I happily said hello to them. Then, like every other day, I would go to the bus stop near my house to catch the earliest bus to my workplace, starting a busy day at the office. I also found it interesting to sit on the bus like this when I could directly see the people around me glued to their phones instead of observing the surrounding life. Contrary to them, I didn't look at my phone too much. Instead, I liked to open the bus window and watch the street outside. On the bus, I could see with my own eyes the old warehouse opposite my apartment, which I always saw first in the morning when I looked into my binoculars. This time, I no longer saw the workers working there, but instead, a girl in a red dress standing in front of the warehouse. The young girl stood facing the wall, looking very mysterious, but strangely, the people around did not care about this girl's existence. She stood there for a long time, not knowing what she was looking at, but seemed very attentive, not paying attention to the flow of people behind her. This thing also made me curious. I kept watching the girl because of the strangeness she radiated around and caught my attention, but then I also considered this a common thing. I no longer paid attention to the strange girl, but continued to sit in my seat, calmly waiting for the bus to take me to the office. Day after day, my hectic work schedule made looking at the street through the binoculars less and less because I had to go to the office every day. I continued to the bus stop and waited for my first bus of the day. I continued to choose a chair close to the window so I could see the opposite curb and freely open the window, putting my head out to admire the scenery. I kept walking past the old warehouse. The warehouse still didn't open. The door was closed for days, but what surprised me was not the shutdown of this place. I kept seeing the strange girl in the red dress again. She was still standing in the same position with her eyes fixed on the wall. I began to be a little surprised and confused when I did not know why this young girl was always standing in such a position. The incomprehension unknowingly made my mind uneasy. Even though the bus had passed a warehouse, I couldn't help but turn my gaze to the strange girl. That night I worked overtime and got home pretty late. That's why I couldn't take the bus home as usual, but had to choose to walk. But thanks to that, I was able to walk past the old warehouse and meet the girl who worked at a restaurant next door. After greeting the girl for a few sentences, I continued to walk back to my apartment. The road from the warehouse to my apartment was only one intersection apart, so it didn't make me tired. On the way, I also met many people, including a white-haired older man walking in the opposite direction from me. After that, I passed the old warehouse again and continued to meet the strange girl who was still in the same position as in the morning. This time, I was able to see the girl with my own eyes, to see her strangeness and mystery more clearly. I suddenly felt a bit cold when I saw a young girl standing with her face against a wall like that. I moved closer to the girl, clearly feeling her coldness. The girl stood like that for a long time. For fear of her finding out, I pretended to hold the phone as if I was texting someone. After that, I tried to make a phone call, but my eyes didn't stop moving toward the young girl. But thanks to that, I could see the abnormality of the girl. The young girl looked a bit sad, but her face was dim. I stood with her for a long time and then came back to my apartment. The following morning I sat on the bus again and passed the warehouse. At this time, I just asked people around and found out that this warehouse had stopped working. But what intrigued me was the connection between the young girl and the warehouse. I accidentally discovered something happening in front of the warehouse on the way. A crowd of people stood around, crowded in front of the warehouse. I didn't know what was going on, but I had a feeling something was wrong. I hurriedly signaled to stop the bus and then ran from the bus to the other warehouse. I felt worried for that strange girl. I didn't know what was happening to her. When I arrived, I saw the presence of the police. Everything was quite serious. A young man was escorted to the station by the police and the crowd. I came to the older man that I often met to ask what was going on. As soon as the older man saw me, he told me there was a serious case here. The police were hunting for the guy who threw the acid on the young girl there a few days ago, and the press was reporting it. I panicked, not thinking that the girl in trouble was the girl I had met before. I couldn't sleep that night because I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I stayed awake until the middle of the night when I decided to search for the strange things. I started to open my computer and search for information on this case. It turned out that this young man had a crush on a young girl I met, but the girl had no feelings, so she repeatedly rejected the guy. But everything would be okay if the young girl's refusal inadvertently made the guy feel hurt. Since then, the man had held a grudge, determined to take revenge and find ways to harm the young girl. It happened a long time ago, and until now the killer had been arrested. That dead girl was the girl I met. This girl died before I met her, and the scene of the crime was in front of the warehouse where I met the young girl. I was shocked to see the news and felt extremely strange and scared. After a while, my computer suddenly had trouble, causing me to panic. Suddenly, a clip was sent out of nowhere to my computer. The person in the clip was the girl in trouble. This time the girl called out to me and slowly turned her face to look at me, but her face was destroyed by acid, making me feel extremely haunted, so I quickly turned off the computer. But I still heard that young girl's voice echoing on the computer, so I ran away. I ran out of my room and headed for the stairs. While running downstairs, I suddenly felt someone push me from behind. I immediately fell to the ground from above in pain. I tried to get up, but my legs started to throb, and I couldn't move anymore. I had to use all my strength to run away from this ghostly building. But the more I ran, the more I felt like I was lost at the starting point. In front of my eyes also appeared the figure of the girl in red. The girl asked me why I stopped following her and looked at me with a disfigured face. So I was scared that I couldn't speak. My whole body started to shake. But a moment later, the red-dressed girl disappeared. Because of that, I fell to the ground, unable to regain my astral soul. Suddenly, beside me appeared a voice calling my name. When I looked up, I saw the girl next door on the same floor as me, looking at me with worry. The girl asked me because she was afraid I would fall down the stairs, but I could not answer. In my heart at that time, I was constantly afraid of the horror story with the dead red-dressed girl. I did not dare to sleep in my apartment that night, but went to a friend's apartment to ask for shelter. The following morning, I met a colleague with the same interests. I called my colleague and told him what I needed to say. I advised him not to look at strange things anymore. I also had an amulet on my neck at that time, in the hope that I would never experience horror stories like this again. I worked as a ranger, so most of my days were spent in the jungle. I was driving to work in the company car and began measuring and photographing until late in the evening, after which I would return home. Chen, an unmarried middle-aged man, was the driver of my company. Shen drove me and my colleague to work as usual, set a timer to pick us up, and quickly drove away. However, the sky was beginning to darken at the foot of the mountain today, and Chen had yet to come back, causing me and my colleague great concern. My colleague waited in rage because if it got dark, getting out of this forest would be dangerous because the road was very rough. The car arrived after the sun had completely set. Of course, my colleague and I were both exhausted. As my colleague carried his belongings to the car, he irritated the driver by being slow and late for his appointment. My colleague then sat next to the driver. Instead of apologizing for what he had done, this driver simply explained that he had a reason for picking us up so late. However, my colleague's reaction was one of curiosity rather than sympathy. Seeing this, the driver offered to buy this colleague a meal as an apology and promised to tell him the incident that caused him to be late. That evening, the driver drove my colleague to his home and ate a simple meal. His mother brought out a large plate of food from the kitchen. Because both of them had to work the next day, so they couldn't drink much, just ate a simple meal with a bit of wine. At the start of the meal, the colleague inquired of the driver as to why he went to the forest so late today. The driver stated that he had been driving early, but on the way he came across a beautiful girl and assisted her. He was driving to the edge of the forest at the time. However, on the way he was unexpectedly met by a person standing in front of his car. The driver rushed over and saw a young girl beckoning him with a towel, but she was alone, as if she was lost. What struck him about this girl was the white handkerchief she used to call him, and she appeared to be a girl from a recluse and traditional family living in the forest. He couldn't leave a young girl being alone like that in the jungle, so he went over to her, stopped the car in front of her, and inquired about her situation. The young girl approached the driver gently and asked if he could drive her to her house because she was lost and couldn't find her way home. Seeing such a lovely young lady, the driver couldn't help but invite her to his car and ask for her address so that he could bring her home as soon as possible. After showing the driver the way, the two sat happily chatting side by side. The girl's young feminine beauty quickly captivated the driver, making him a little enamored. According to the young lady's instructions, the driver finally could take her home on the trail that led to the forest's end. She also told the driver that she was worried when leaving her mother at home alone. This made the driver even more smitten with the young lady. He couldn't take his eyes off her face. He kept looking at her and was always being caught by her. After a while, the driver also dropped her off in a residential area surrounded by vast fields where she could walk home. After that, the young girl went into her house, but the driver continued to keep an eye on her figure. He discovered that she had left items in his car. It was her white handkerchief. Perhaps she was in a hurry, so she forgot it on the chair. Because he was still busy with work and believed that this handkerchief was a predestined sign that would allow him to see the young girl again, he decided to keep it so that the next day he would have a reason to see her again. Hearing this, my colleague became excited, smiled happily at the driver and promised to accompany him the next day. As usual, the driver arrived early the next morning to pick up the colleague, and the two of them set off together. The driver was supposed to take this colleague to the other girl's house first, according to the original plan. However, I was in the car, making the two of them feel hampered. When the other colleague noticed this, he immediately discussed with the driver leaving me in the forest and then go to the girl's house to return the handkerchief to her. That day, I had to work alone in the forest, and the two of them returned to the old road to get to the girl's house. Upon arrival in the residential area, my colleague went to ask the neighbors for the girl's exact address. According to the description, the two eventually found a neighbor who knew the young girl's address and was eager to accompany them. The girl's house was at the far end of the village, and the outside was deafeningly quiet. The two came up to the door and boldly knocked. After a while, the girl's mother emerged from the house and inquired as to what they were looking for. They both said, "Come here to return the items to the girls in the house." However, this mother did not allow the two to enter the house and loudly chased them away because she suspected the two were imposters. When my colleague felt the situation was very strange, he immediately blocked the door and insisted on entering the house to meet the girl, but his aggressive demeanor frightened the elderly mother even more. According to the mother, these two were the impersonating scammers. The driver only recently confirmed that he was the one who brought this girl home yesterday. However, the mother did not believe it and even insisted that such a strange thing could not happen. When the driver noticed this, he immediately took out the girl's handkerchief to show her mother. When the mother saw the handkerchief, she immediately changed her attitude. Her face was a little sorrowful, and she inquired as to why the two of them had the handkerchief. After that, the mother invited these two men into the house, where they were surprised to discover the truth. The mother offered the two some drinks and thanked them for bringing the handkerchief back because it belonged to her deceased daughter. She couldn't hide her emotion as she looked at her child's handkerchief, breaking down in tears when she remembered her poor daughter. She stated that her daughter was in the forest a few days ago when she unintentionally stepped on a landmine and she could not survive. The villagers discovered the girl's charred black body, but she couldn't close her eyes with peace because she didn't have her handkerchief. With the discovery of her daughter's handkerchief, the mother could finally use it to cover her daughter's disfigured face in the coffin and bury her. After telling the truth, the mother also sent the two men on the road late at night. The two of them left with a great concern about the fact that Chen had met the girl's spirit in the forest. After that, my colleague also forgot about it. He and I set out for the forest the next morning, but he refused to let me take the same bus that day. When the colleague saw the driver's emaciated appearance as he was getting into the car, he expressed concern. Didn't know why his face became so haggard after only one night. He immediately recounted how he had trouble sleeping that night before when he dreamt that the spirit of the dead girl came to demand to bring him to hell. The girl appeared with her body covered in blood and worms, looked at the sleeping man and touched his face with her hand. He could feel the coldness of the girl's dead body, especially when her hand was passionately caressing him. The man awoke immediately and stayed awake all night because he was too terrified. Seeing this, my colleague tried to calm him down, ensuring him that nothing would happen. That day, the car and my co-driver unexpectedly rushed down the abyss and burst into flames. At the end of the year, my neighborhood suddenly built an exhibition area. Just a few days ago, the exhibition area had quickly attracted so many people. Most of the paintings here depicted women from many different countries with different expressions and nuances. Because the exhibition area just finished building, there was still an opening position as a night shift security guard with a fairly stable salary, so I took that opportunity to apply to work here, both to earn more income and to be convenient for my studies. After discussing with the manager, who was also an old security guard, in the morning I could rest and work the night shift. Because of the nature of my job, I would usually work in the computer room to watch the security cameras, do a few rounds of preliminary checks until the middle of the night, then start taking a nap with the manager. My first day at work began. At that time it was already dark and the visitors had already left. In the exhibition area, there were only me and the older security guard. He took me on a tour around so that I knew the way here and taught me things to keep in mind when working. He took me to a gallery hidden in a far corner. This gallery wasn't mentioned before, so it made me curious. He told me this was the owner's private gallery and the duty of the security guard that night was to strictly inspect the gallery. This was strange because I had never heard of or mentioned this mysterious gallery since then. But for a newbie like me, this was not something I needed to worry about, so I just needed to take a look to know. In the middle of the night, the older security guard took me to the secret gallery, where people were not allowed to go without permission. The cold atmosphere in that place attracted me, but the security guard told me no matter what, when passing that gallery I mustn't discuss, comment or say anything, and especially I should not go in there alone. The mystery of this gallery made me even more curious. I wanted to go inside once to experience it. I asked the security guard why there were such regulations here, but before he could reply, he received a phone call that seemed important. So before he could answer my question, he said he had an important job and he had to go out. After that, he went straight out of the duty room, leaving me alone in the room with many unanswered questions. In the meantime, I scrolled through my phone in boredom, but I didn't see him back until late at night, so I made a reckless decision. I slightly looked at the clock. It was past midnight. I knew that the other security guard was busy, so I thought about going alone to be able to rest early, later. No sooner than later, I grabbed the flashlight and left the duty room alone, heading straight for the secret gallery outside. Walking a few steps, I finally reached a gallery full of mysteries. The surrounding space was also strangely dark, which made me a little cold. I couldn't take my eyes off the door of the room. There was some invisible power that kept urging me to go inside, but then I decided to turn back because I couldn't stand the cold air. I had just turned my back when suddenly a woman's giggle rang out in the room. I immediately returned to the secret gallery and assumed that someone was in the gallery. I decided to ignore the other security guard's advice. I brought a flashlight inside and carefully checked every corner of the room. But when I went inside, this room had nothing too special to attract me, but an empty room with nothing in it. Suddenly, I had the feeling that someone was watching me from behind with cold, blood-red eyes. I immediately turned around and found an oil painting hanging in the middle of the room, depicting a beautiful young girl fiddling with a favorite flower. I didn't know who the woman in this picture was, but the content of the painting was nothing special for everyone here to keep it a secret. I was impressed with the sad eyes of the girl in the picture. It seemed that in her heart there was an indescribable pain. After seeing the picture, I was going to go back to my duty room, but at that moment the girl's eyes suddenly started bleeding. The girl looked like she was crying, but her eyes were bright red, which made me scared, shaking. After a while, I felt like I was trapped in this gallery with a pool of crimson blood on the floor. It was like being drowned by the blood tears of the girl in the picture. The scene was so horrible that I couldn't forget it. The girl's tears suddenly turned fierce like a wave that wanted to wash me out of the room. After struggling for a while, I thought I would lose my life, but I woke up and found myself sitting in the room on duty without knowing it. I screamed in fear and regained my composure. The other security guard saw that I was fully awake. He sat down across from me and asked why I was alone in there and if I had seen anything strange. I didn't hide it from him and told him the whole scene that I saw in that secret gallery. I thought that he would not believe me, but he reassured me and said not only me but the people who worked in the past, anyone who entered the gallery alone had the same problem. I knew it all started with the only picture hanging in the room, so I immediately asked him the origin of that painting. The security guard originally planned not to tell me because he was worried about me and he was too afraid to think about it. So after seeing my accident, he knew he couldn't hide it anymore. The security guard told me that in the past this painting was sold by a rich businessman who liked to collect antique paintings. Many rich people hunt for a painting not because of its content or because its creator was a famous artist, but because of the paint color used to paint this picture. The artist who painted the picture was called a mad painter, a pervert with a strong passion for painting. When making this painting, the artist felt unsatisfied with his work, so he devised a new way of mixing colors to make the picture look more real. He kidnapped young girls around the same age as the girl in the picture and secretly brought them home. After that, he killed the victims and then drained the victims' blood using it to color the paintings. He mixed the victim's blood into the palette, used it to draw the first strokes of the work. As he thought, the colors after being mixed with blood also became more vivid. In just 1 week he was able to complete the painting with emotional strokes, but with sadness and a bit of gloom. Many people also say that when painting, he would leave the victim's body behind, facing the painting as a way for the victims to see his work. The souls of the victims were killed by him accidentally breathed their souls into the painting, making the painting famous but also a way for the victims' souls to reside inside the painting. After finishing, he had not time to enjoy and look at his work when the police suddenly rushed in and arrested him. The artist was later sentenced to death, but the case of the painter using blood became a hot topic of discussion everywhere. The painting had since been cursed as well, but it had been hunted by many rich people and passed on from person to person. The guards were on duty at night in the exhibition area. If they went alone at night, they would be teased by the spirits of the girls in the paintings, threatened to faint, and because they were too scared, They then resigned. Therefore, the owner of this exhibition had banned anyone from going to the secret gallery alone, especially at night. The secret guard knew that I was also curious about the painting, but he specifically said that he would take me inside to see it in detail. This time, I went back. The picture was a little softer than the original, and no more strange things happened. I looked at the picture for a long time, felt the eyes of the girl in the picture as if she was watching me. After a while, the security guard took me out, ended the shift, and began to rest when it was almost morning. The painting is still there. Unfortunately, this was a beautiful work of art, but no one would admire it. It was a story that happened a long time ago in my village, and I heard it from my grandmother on an occasion when I returned to my hometown. At the time, my family had a funeral. I went with my parents to my hometown to attend the funeral in a gloomy atmosphere. After the ceremony, I looked at my grandmother and saw her looking at the coffin with sad eyes. I was worried, so I went over to talk to her. My grandmother had lived in this village for a long time, so she understood everything that happened in there. She told me a very famous Retribution story. When she was a child, there was a large migration in my village with people from different regions moving here. Among them was a family with 3 brothers. People didn't know how much money they brought into the village, but 3 brothers were able to build a large mansion on the east side of the village. Many people noticed and speculated that these 3 brothers were doing illegal business, so they hid there. I wouldn't matter if the eldest brother, who did not know who to listen to, invited his 2 youngest brothers to find an abandoned grave and worship in the attic for blessings and prosperous business. The 3 of them discussed going to the forest to find an abandoned grave because my village was a place of war at that time, and there were countless abandoned graves. The following morning, all 3 brothers blew trumpets and drums and then went into the forest to find an abandoned grave. Many people in the village did not pay much attention because they thought it was a religious custom in their hometown of 3 people. After entering the forest, one of the 3 found a grave covered with weeds, likely covered with a large mound of earth, but without a tombstone. All 3 brothers were overjoyed. They thought they had found an abandoned grave. They immediately performed the grave-digging ceremony to bring the deceased's remains to their home. After worshipping, the 3 brothers blew trumpets and drums, brought the body of the person lying in the grave home and worshipped it like a family member. After the funeral was completed, the 3 brothers put the body in a large coffin and placed it in the attic with many offerings. This story reached the ears of the people in the village. They thought that this was a way for the 3 brothers to get rich, so they talked about it and demanded to learn in the 3 brothers' own way. Until one day, at the door of the 3 brothers' house appeared an older woman dressed in rags, hurriedly banged on the door with an extremely urgent gesture. The 3 brothers did not understand what was going on and opened the door. As soon as she saw the 3 of them, the older woman pointed her finger and said that all 3 had stolen her husband's grave. When the eldest brother heard it, he angrily chased the older woman out, thinking that the old woman wasted her mind talking nonsense, and then stormed inside the house. The older woman was chased away, but she refused to accept it. She kept hugging her husband's photo, sitting in front of the 3 brothers' door to reclaim her husband's body. Curious people in the village asked about the story and learned the beginning and the end of the story. Everyone felt dissatisfied with the work of these 3 brothers. The men in the village, seeing this, invited each other to go to the house of the 3 brothers to claim justice for the older woman and reclaim the older man's body. Everyone rushed with sticks and rushed to ask the 3 brothers to return the older woman's husband's body back to its original position. At first, the 3 brothers always denied it, making many people in the village angry. People demanded to go to the attic to see the body for verification. At this moment, the three brothers revealed their true nature as delinquents. They used guns to suppress the people in the village. The youngest brother refused to negotiate with the people in the village, blatantly shot and threatened to make everyone panic. The whole village at the time was in an uproar, thinking that these brothers were thieves and robbers from elsewhere and determined to live and die with them. But with their aggressive nature, the three brothers still refused to return the body part and threatened to shoot anyone who dared to take the body away. While fighting and exchanging words, the older woman accidentally tripped on a stone on the ground and fell backwards. The fall caused the older woman to hit her head hard on the steps. She was stunned and died on the spot. The older woman's accident made everyone in the village sad. After knowing that the older woman died alone without children plight, the people held her funeral for her. Her body was placed in a coffin built by the villagers and a small worship ceremony was held. A single funeral took place in solitude in just one day. The older woman's body was buried by the villagers. Her grave was placed right at the older man's dug grave. Not long after the older woman's funeral took place, my grandmother often went with her great-grandmother to visit the older woman's house to smoke incense. The great-grandmother accidentally saw the older woman's husband's photo and panicked when she saw that his left eye was gouged out with a large hole. After seeing that, my grandmother was scared. The great-grandmother tried to comfort her. Then she explained that the older man had a broken eye in the past, so when making a picture of the shrine, they had to blur his damaged eye to avoid causing fear to those who were afraid to visit. Later, it was discovered that the older woman clutched another photo of her husband and carried it to the grave with her. Not long after, the eldest brother went to find a matchmaker in the village, bringing some money to ask her to make a maid for a beautiful young girl. Thinking that the matchmaker would agree with the money, the eldest brother was kicked out by herself and mercilessly cursed for the cruel actions of the three brothers before. The eldest brother could not persuade the matchmaker to leave with pity, but from then on, he became disgusted with the whole village. He went to the neighboring village to marry a stupid girl, and then he held a lavish wedding to show his prestige to the people in the village. He then took his wife to live in this lavish mansion with his two younger brothers. After living for a while, the wife became pregnant. While the eldest brother's wife was pregnant, the middle brother also started to marry a girl from another village. Next, the youngest brother also held a wedding. The wedding of the three brothers all had one thing in common, which was to organize a great party, but no one attended but the poor beggars. All three still thought that this thing was a good action. After a few days, the wife and the eldest brother suddenly went into labor and was about to give birth. Seeing this, the eldest brother sent someone to find the most famous midwife in the village to deliver his wife's birth. His wife gave birth to a child very easily. She gave birth to a beautiful white son within a few hours. Looking at the red beautiful baby, the eldest brother felt happy, thanking the midwife that day. The first son seemed to take over the love of the eldest brother, but only after the midwife left did the child suddenly change. The eldest brother looked at his son in shock. He didn't believe that he would have to face this cruel truth one day. The baby just opened his eyes to look at his father, revealing a broken left eye, very scary and white. The eldest brother immediately invited the magician to ask him to check the baby's fate. After learning that this child was karma for digging the graves of three brothers, the eldest brother heartlessly left his child in the forest in the cold snow to die. The people in the village immediately spread the story of the three brothers who met with such retribution that they gave birth to a child who lost an eye. This story gradually became an obsession for the three of them, causing all three to continuously pray for the older man lying in the coffin in the attic for help. Day by day, rumors were increasing that no one dared to approach the house of the three brothers. Their entire large mansion was also locked and bolted, not communicating with anyone, creating a dark and scary atmosphere. Not long after that, it was the middle brother's wife's turn to give birth. This time, the eldest brother found a shaman to ask for doing the expiration ceremony. But luck did not come to the unfortunate girl when the midwife said that the middle brother's wife had difficulty giving birth. After giving birth to a son, the wife began to bleed and could only choose to save the mother of the child. The husband immediately asked the shaman to come in and see that the wife was lying on the bed. The wife grabbed the shaman's hand, begged him to save his son, and stopped breathing. The shaman was powerless to find a way to save the child's life and accept to sacrifice the mother. The death of his wife made the middle brother feel very sad, but he could only put his hope on his only child. The shaman stood outside and told the eldest brother about his family's retribution. But no matter what the shaman said, the eldest still didn't believe it, insisting that this was nonsense. It was not until the child was brought out that the shaman appeared surprised. He looked at the baby with a completely damaged eye. The condition was worse than that of the eldest brother's child. This child was born prematurely, so he died soon after and was buried in a deep forest. A mournful atmosphere enveloped the whole house, making many people feel suffocated. For a while, all three brothers discussed that they would bring the bodies of the middle brother's wife and son to be buried next to each other to save their grief. But no matter what he did, the middle brother still suffered from the insults and gossip of the villagers. Because he couldn't bear it anymore, the middle brother silently carried all his luggage and then quietly disappeared. The eldest brother then picked up his luggage and left the village, going to another place to live, leaving the youngest brother and his wife behind. As time passed, when my grandmother was an adult, she accidentally met my mother and daughter on the street playing with each other. The child was also very awkward walking. He walked unsteadily as if he couldn't see one side. My grandmother was curious, so she went to check it out and discovered that this child was the son of the youngest brother. The child turned to look at my grandmother with a broken white eye. Looking at the child's damaged eye, my grandmother immediately remembered the older man with a broken eye she saw in the photo on the day of the disaster in the village. At this point, my grandmother began to sigh, showing pity for the fate of innocent children. After that, Grandma said I have to live well, otherwise no one could help me. At this moment, I remembered the man I accidentally met on the street, curled up in the corner of the village, smoking, with a sad, lonely attitude and a broken eye.